The camera opens with a bustling cafeteria, the kind you'd find in any elementary school, brightly lit, with rows of long tables filled with chattering kids balancing trays of pizza slices, milk cartons, and apples. The energy is pure chaos, yet comfortingly familiar. But as the lens zooms in on a small table near the back, the atmosphere shifts. A group of young girls sits together, their backpacks slung over the chairs, but their laughter is subdued, their eyes glancing at a single tray in front of them. At the center of the group sits a little girl named Amaya. Her hair is neatly braided, her uniform spotless, but her tray looks vastly different from everyone else's. Amaya pokes at the sandwich in front of her, a limp, crusty piece of bread with an unidentifiable smear in the middle. Next to it sits an apple with a soft brown patch spreading across its surface. Across the table, her friend Kayla furrows her brow. "Amaya, that's not right." Kayla whispers, leaning in close, "You deserve the same lunch as the rest of us." Amaya shrugs, avoiding her friend's gaze. "It's fine," she mutters. "I'm used to it." But it isn't fine. Not to Kayla, not to the other girls sitting there. Day after day they've noticed it. While their lunches are fresh and appetizing, Amaya's tray looks like an afterthought. Stale bread, bruised fruit, milk cartons just a few days too close to their expiration date. They'd asked her about it before, but Amaya always brushes it off with the same resigned shrug. What none of them know is that Amaya has been holding back a secret, something she's too scared to say out loud. Every time she walks up to the lunch counter, the same thing happens. Mrs. Wilkins, the head lunch lady, barely looks at her before reaching under the counter to grab something that's clearly different from what the other kids are getting. And it's always the same. A sandwich she can hardly eat, fruit she doesn't dare bite into, and milk she knows better than to open. Kayla can't shake the feeling that this isn't just an accident. "We need to do something," she tells the group one afternoon during recess. The girls huddle together under the big oak tree in the schoolyard, their voices low. "This isn't fair. Someone needs to see what's happening." "But how?" Another friend, Jasmine, asks, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "If we say something, they'll just tell us we're making it up." Kayla bites her lip, thinking hard. Then her face lights up. "We'll record it. If no one believes us, we'll show them." The plan sets a quiet buzz of excitement through the group. The next day, they're ready. Kayla borrows her older brother's phone, its camera primed and ready to capture the truth. She hides it in the front pocket of her hoodie, angling it carefully as they line up for lunch. Amaya is last in line, just like always. As the other girls pick up their trays, they keep an eye on the counter. From her perch behind the serving line, Mrs. Wilkins looks up, her expression neutral as the other kids come through. But the moment Amaya steps forward, her face tightens ever so slightly, a flicker of annoyance that might have gone unnoticed if Kayla weren't watching so closely. The camera captures everything. Mrs. Wilkins reaching under the counter, pulling out a tray that's already been set aside. It's unmistakable. The sandwich, the bruised apple, the questionable milk. They're already there, waiting for Amaya before she even speaks. Kayla's hands tighten around the phone as she records, her heart pounding. Why is this happening? What could possibly make someone treat Amaya this way? And how long has it been going on? When Amaya walks back to the table, her friends exchange uneasy glances. They all know what they've seen, but none of them can bring themselves to say it yet. The tension in the air is thick, their usual chatter replaced by the weight of what they've just witnessed. "Did you get it?" Jasmine whispers once Mrs. Wilkins is out of earshot. Kayla nods, her voice barely above a breath. "Yeah, we got everything." But what they captured is only the beginning. As they replay the footage later that night, sitting cross-legged on Kayla's bedroom floor, they start to realize that this video might be more powerful than they thought. It's not just about proving what's happening to Amaya. It's about standing up for her in a way she's never been able to do for herself. And as the screen goes dark, they all know one thing for sure. They can't keep this a secret any longer. The next morning, the air in the schoolyard feels heavier than usual. Kayla, Jasmine, and the others stick close to Amaya, glancing nervously at one another. The phone, now holding a secret too big for any of them to keep, is tucked safely in Kayla's backpack. None of them has said much since watching the video, but the unspoken truth sits between them, impossible to ignore. Amaya notices the shift right away. "What's wrong?" she asks, her voice tinged with worry. Her brown eyes dart from one friend to the next, searching their faces for answers. Kayla hesitates. "We need to talk about what's been happening," she says carefully. "About Mrs. Wilkins and your lunches." Amaya's shoulders slump, and she looks down, fiddling with the straps of her backpack. "I told you it's not a big deal," she murmurs. "It's just lunch." "It is a big deal," Jasmine blurts out, unable to hold back anymore. "We saw it, Amaya. We recorded it." Amaya freezes, her eyes wide. "You what?" "We recorded her," Kayla says softly. "We wanted to show you and maybe someone else, so people would understand. It's not okay, Amaya. None of this is okay." For a moment, Amaya looks like she might cry, but then her face hardens, her small hands balling into fists. "You don't get it," she snaps. "Even if you show someone, nothing's going to change. They'll just say it's my fault. Or worse, they'll ignore it." "Why would it be your fault?" Jasmine asks, confused. "You didn't do anything wrong." Amaya lets out a frustrated sigh, her voice cracking as she speaks. "Because it's always like this, okay? People like me always have to deal with stuff like this. My mom says it's better to keep your head down and not make trouble, or things can get worse." Her words hang in the air, silencing the group. None of them know what to say. They've always thought of themselves as equals, friends who share everything, from snacks to secrets. But this is a part of Amaya's world they've never fully understood. Kayla's resolve hardens. "No," she says firmly, her voice breaking the silence. "That's not right. You shouldn't have to deal with this, Amaya. And we're not going to just sit by and let it happen." Amaya looks at her, uncertain. "What are you going to do? Show the video to a teacher? They'll just call Mrs. Wilkinson and she'll deny everything." Kayla shakes her head. "We'll figure something out. But we're not letting this slide." The bell rings, pulling them out of their tense conversation. The group walks to class together, but the unease lingers. As the day drags on, Kayla's mind keeps racing. Who would actually listen to them? Who would believe the video? And more importantly, what would happen to Mrs. Wilkins if they spoke up? The thought of an adult getting into trouble, even for something so unfair, makes her stomach twist. But then she remembers the look on Amaya's face every time she stares down at her tray, trying to pretend it doesn't bother her. By the time lunch rolls around, Kayla has a plan, or at least the start of one. She tells Jasmine and the others to act normal while she gathers more evidence. "We need to show it's not just one time," she whispers. "If this has been going on for a while, we need to prove it." Amaya looks nervous, but she doesn't argue. When it's her turn to go through the line, she does what she always does, keeps her head down, mumbles her thanks, and takes the tray without looking up. Kayla's camera catches every moment. Mrs. Wilkins barely glances at her before pulling out another sad-looking meal from under the counter, her movements brisk and dismissive. But this time, something different happens. Another lunch lady, Ms. Patel, is watching from the other side of the kitchen. She frowns, her hands pausing mid-motion as she serves a tray of mashed potatoes to another student. Her eyes flick to Mrs. Wilkins, then back to Amaya's tray, and for a second, it looks like she might say something. But then she goes back to work, her expression unreadable. Kayla catches the interaction on camera, her pulse quickening. Maybe Ms. Patel knows something. Maybe she's seen this happen before. The possibility gives Kayla hope, but it also raises more questions. If Ms. Patel knows, why hasn't she done anything about it? Is she scared of Mrs. Wilkins, or is there something else going on? After lunch, the group gathers in the library, their usual hangout spot when they need to talk without being overheard. Kayla pulls out her phone, showing them the new footage. They watch in silence as Mrs. Wilkins hands Amaya the same subpar meal, her expression unreadable. Then Kayla rewinds to the moment with Ms. Patel, pausing the video. "Did you see that?" she asks, pointing to the screen. She noticed. She knows something's wrong. Jasmine nods slowly. "Maybe we should talk to her." "And say what?" Amaya asks, her voice skeptical. If she wanted to help, she would have done it already. Maybe she's scared, Kayla suggests, or maybe she doesn't know how to stop it. Either way, she might be the key to figuring this out. The group agrees to keep watching Ms. Patel, hoping she'll give them more clues. But as the week goes on, things get stranger. Mrs. Wilkins seems more tense than usual, her sharp eyes scanning the cafeteria as she senses she's being watched. Meanwhile, Ms. Patel starts acting differently too. She avoids eye contact with Mrs. Wilkins, her movements hurried and stiff. One afternoon, Kayla catches her glancing at Amaya's tray again, her lips pressed into a tight line. Then, just when the group thinks they're making progress, something unexpected happens. On Friday, Amaya's tray is different. Instead of the usual stale bread and bruised fruit, it's filled with fresh food. A sandwich piled high with turkey and cheese, a crisp apple, and a perfectly cold carton of milk. The girls stare at the tray in shock. Amaya looks at it like it might disappear as she blinks too hard. "What?" "What happened?" she whispers. "Maybe they figured out we're watching," Jasmine says, her voice low. Kayla frowns uneasy. Or maybe it's something else. Her instincts prove right later that afternoon when Ms. Patil catches her alone in the hallway. The lunch lady looks nervous, her hands twisting the hem of her apron as she leans in close. "I saw you girls watching this week," she whispers. "Be careful. Mrs. Wilkins doesn't like people snooping around." Kayla's heart pounds. Why, she asks, her voice barely audible. "What's going on?" Miss Patel hesitates, glancing over her shoulder. "It's complicated," she says finally. "Just stay out of it, okay? You don't want to make this worse." And with that she's gone, leaving Kayla more determined and more scared than ever. Whatever's happening in that cafeteria, it's bigger than they realized, and they're not backing down until they uncover the truth. Kayla couldn't get Ms. Patel's warning out of her head. The words kept circling her thoughts, their meaning heavy and unsettling. Stay out of it. You don't want to make this worse. Worse for who? For Amaya? For them? Or for Ms. Patel herself? The more Kayla thought about it, the more determined she became. Something was happening in that cafeteria, and she couldn't ignore it. Over the weekend, the group gathered at Jasmine's house, sitting cross-legged on the plush rug in her living room. Kayla spread her phone and notebook out on the coffee table, the recordings queued up and ready. "We have to figure this out," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Mrs. Wilkins, Ms. Patel, all of it. Something's going on, and it's not just about stale food." Amaya sat quietly, staring at the carpet. She hadn't touched her lemonade or the cookies Jasmine's mom had brought in earlier. Her friends gave her space, knowing she was still processing everything. It was Jasmine who finally broke the silence. "Maybe Ms. Patel knows more than she's letting on," Jasmine said, her voice soft but thoughtful. "She looked really scared when she talked to you." Kayla nodded. "I think so too. But if she's scared, then that means Mrs. Wilkins is up to something bigger. It's not just her being mean. It's like she's hiding something." Jasmine frowned. But what could it be? It's just a school lunchroom. Kayla didn't have an answer, and the uncertainty made her stomach churn. "I don't know yet, but I think we need to keep recording, keep watching. If we can catch her doing something worse, or if Ms. Patel decides to talk, we might figure it out." The next week at school, the tension in the cafeteria was impossible to ignore. Mrs. Wilkins seemed even more on edge, her movements sharp and mechanical as she handed out trays. She didn't make eye contact with any of the kids, but Kayla felt her gaze pass over their table like a shadow. Amaya's lunches stayed fresh, but the group couldn't shake the feeling that it was only temporary, like Mrs. Wilkins was testing them to see if they would let it go. Then came the day when everything shifted. It started with something small, a carton of milk. Amaya had opened it at lunch, only to wrinkle her nose and pull it away. "This smells weird," she said, her voice low. Kayla leaned over, her brow furrowed. "Let me see." She sniffed the milk, then grimaced. It was sour, the kind of smell that made her stomach turn. "This is expired," she said, her voice louder than she intended. Jasmine looked over at the lunch counter, her eyes narrowing. "She's doing it again." Amaya hesitated, her face a mix of frustration and embarrassment. "Maybe it's just a mistake," she said, but the doubt in her voice was clear. "It's not a mistake," Kayla said firmly. She pulled out her phone, opening the camera. "Let's make sure everyone knows it's not." That afternoon, Kayla stayed after school, waiting outside the cafeteria until the halls were quiet. She had decided to talk to Ms. Patel, no matter how nervous it made her. When the lunch lady finally emerged, holding a stack of clean trays, Kayla stepped forward. "Ms. Patel," she said, her voice steady but her palms clammy. "I need to ask you something." Ms. Patel froze, her eyes darting toward the cafeteria doors. "Kayla, I told you." "Please," Kayla interrupted. "I just want to help Amaya. She doesn't deserve this. None of us do." Ms. Patel's expression softened, but her shoulders stayed tense. She glanced around the hallway, then leaned in closer. "You're brave, but you don't understand," she whispered. "Mrs. Wilkins has been here for years. She knows how to cover her tracks. If you push too hard, you'll only make things worse for Amaya." "But why?" Kayla pressed. "Why does she do this? Why Amaya?" Ms. Patel hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, it looked like she might say something, but then she shook her head. "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. "I have my own family to think about." Before Kayla could respond, Ms. Patel hurried down the hall, leaving her standing there, frustrated and confused. She didn't understand why everyone seemed so afraid of Mrs. Wilkins. What could possibly make her so untouchable? The answer came later that week when Jasmine stumbled across something unexpected. She had been helping her mom search for old tax records in their filing cabinet when she found a folder marked Community Board Meetings. Curious, she opened it and began flipping through the pages. That's when she saw it, a list of names under the heading District Food Supply Committee. And there it was, Mrs. Wilkins' name, right near the top. The next day, Jasmine brought the folder to school, showing it to Kayla during lunch. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the page. "She's not just the lunch lady. She's on the committee that decides where the food comes from." Kayla's jaw dropped. "Are you serious? That means she controls what we eat, and probably where the money goes too." The implications hit them both at once. If Mrs. Wilkins was in charge of the food supply, then she had access to all kinds of resources and all kinds of power. It wasn't just about being mean to Amaya. There was something bigger going on, something that went beyond the cafeteria. Over the next few days, the group began piecing together the puzzle. They started noticing things they hadn't before. Delivery trucks pulling up to the cafeteria at odd hours, boxes labeled with unfamiliar logos, and Mrs. Wilkins always watching, her eyes sharp and calculating. The more they observed, the clearer it became that she was hiding something. But what? And why was Amaya caught in the middle of it? As the pieces started coming together, the group realized they were in over their heads. This wasn't just about a mean lunch lady or stale food. It was about control, power, and something they couldn't quite put their fingers on yet. But one thing was certain, they couldn't stop now. Kayla looked around the table at her friends, their faces determined but nervous. "Whatever she's doing," she said, her voice steady, "we're going to find out. We owe it to Amaya and to everyone else." The cafeteria felt different now. Every movement, every word spoken, carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Kayla and the group couldn't unsee the patterns they'd uncovered, and every day only added to their suspicions. Amaya, though still hesitant, had begun to trust her friends a little more, letting them take the lead even as she braced herself for whatever might come next. But even she could sense it, something big was about to happen. The morning started like any other. The kids filed into the cafeteria, trays clattering as they lined up for lunch. Kayla positioned herself near the counter, pretending to talk to Jasmine while discreetly recording. Amaya hung back, just like she always did, her small frame nearly hidden by the other students. From her spot, Kayla could see Mrs. Wilkins, her sharp eyes scanning the line with a precision that made Kayla's stomach churn. It was like she was waiting for something, or someone. When Amaya finally stepped up to the counter, the air seemed to shift. Mrs. Wilkins didn't reach for the prepared tray this time. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice low but harsh. "You've been causing trouble," she said, her words cutting through the noise of the cafeteria. "I don't know what you or your little friends think you're doing, but it stops now." Amaya froze, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. She didn't respond. The fear in her eyes was enough to send Kayla's heart racing. Without thinking, Kayla stepped forward, her phone still recording. "What's your problem?" she demanded, her voice louder than she intended. Mrs. Wilkins straightened, her expression hardening. "You kids don't know how things work around here," she said, her tone cold. "Stay out of grown folks' business, or you'll regret it." The cafeteria had gone eerily quiet, the usual clatter of trays and chatter replaced by a heavy silence. Kids were watching now, their eyes darting between Kayla and Mrs. Wilkins. Kayla's hands were shaking, but she didn't back down. "We know what you're doing," she said, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "And we're not going to let you get away with it." Mrs. Wilkins' jaw tightened, but she didn't say another word. Instead, she turned back to the counter, her movements brisk and dismissive. "Get your lunch and sit down," she snapped. "And keep your nose out of things that don't concern you." Kayla didn't respond. She grabbed Amaya's hand, pulling her away from the line and back to their table. The group sat in stunned silence, the tension between them crackling like static electricity. Jasmine leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" "We keep going," Kayla said, her voice shaking but resolute. "She's scared. That means we're onto something." Later that afternoon, as the group huddled in the library, they reviewed the footage from Kayla's phone. The confrontation was clear, every word captured with crystal clarity. But as they replayed the video, something else caught their attention. In the background, barely noticeable, was Ms. Patel. She was standing near the supply closet, her face pale and her hands clenched at her sides. "She heard everything," Jasmine said, her eyes wide. "She knows something," Kayla agreed, "and we need to get her to talk." The next morning, they found Ms. Patel in the hallway, her eyes darting nervously as she carried a stack of papers. Kayla approached her, her voice calm but insistent. "Ms. Patel, we need your help," she said. "We know something's going on with Mrs. Wilkins, and we think you do too." Ms. Patel hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before pulling them into an empty classroom. She closed the door, her hands shaking as she turned to face them. "You kids don't know what you're getting yourselves into," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Wilkins, she's been doing this for years, skimming from the food budget, cutting corners wherever she can, and anyone who tries to stop her." She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "Let's just say they don't last long around here." Kayla's heart pounded. "But why Amaya?" she asked. "Why is she treating her worse than everyone else?" Ms. Patel looked down, her expression pained. "Because she knows no one will believe a little girl like her. She thinks she can get away with it because Amaya doesn't have anyone to fight for her." "She's wrong," Kayla said fiercely. "Amaya has us." Ms. Patel smiled weakly, but her fear didn't fade. "You have to be careful," she said. "Mrs. Wilkins has connections. She knows people on the district board. If she finds out you're trying to expose her, she'll come after you too." The warning only strengthened Kayla's resolve. She thanked Ms. Patel and promised to be careful, but inside, she knew they couldn't stop now. The stakes were higher than ever, and time was running out. That afternoon, the group made their boldest move yet. Jasmine had overheard some teachers talking about an upcoming inspection, a routine check by the district to make sure everything was running smoothly. It was their chance to bring everything to light. If they could show the inspectors the footage and get Ms. Patel to back them up, they might finally have the proof they needed. But as they prepared for the inspection day, something happened that none of them expected. When they arrived at school the next morning, the cafeteria was closed. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Lunch will be served in classrooms today due to maintenance." Kayla's stomach dropped. "She's trying to cover her tracks," she said, her voice tight with anger. "She knows the inspectors are coming." "What do we do?" Jasmine asked, panic creeping into her voice. Kayla didn't hesitate. "We find out what she's hiding." The group snuck into the cafeteria during recess, their footsteps echoing in the empty room. The usual noise and bustle were replaced by an eerie stillness, and the air smelled faintly of beach. As they crept toward the supply closet, Kayla's heart pounded in her chest. She reached for the door handle, her hands trembling. Inside, they found stacks of boxes, some labeled with familiar logos, others with names they didn't recognize. But it wasn't the boxes that caught their attention. It was the files stacked on the desk in the corner, each one filled with spreadsheets, invoices, and handwritten notes. As Kayla flipped through the papers, her breath caught. The numbers didn't add up. There were discrepancies in the budgets, invoices for food that had never arrived, and payments made to companies that didn't seem to exist. "She's stealing," Jasmine whispered, her voice shaking. "She's been stealing money from the school." Before they could process what they'd found, a noise behind them made them freeze. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cafeteria, growing louder with each passing second. Kayla's heart raced as the door creaked open. They had been caught. The sound of footsteps grew louder, each one echoing in the empty cafeteria like a countdown to disaster. Kayla clutched the papers tighter, her mind racing for an escape plan. Jasmine's wide eyes darted toward the door, while Amaya stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. The door creaked open, and for a moment, none of them moved. It wasn't Mrs. Wilkins. Instead, Ms. Patel stepped into the room, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes swept over the group and the papers in Kayla's hands. "What are you doing here?" she whispered urgently, shutting the door behind her. "We found these," Kayla said, holding up the documents. "Mrs. Wilkins has been stealing money from the food budget, and she's been targeting Amaya to cover it up." Ms. Patel looked over her shoulder, her hands trembling as she grabbed the stack of papers. "You kids shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and frantic. "If she catches you—" "She's not here," Jasmine interrupted, "and we need your help. You know what's going on. You've seen it." Ms. Patel hesitated, the weight of her fear etched across her face. For a moment, it looked like she might walk away, just like before. But then her gaze landed on Amaya, who was clutching her backpack tightly, her small frame trembling. Something shifted in Ms. Patel's expression, an ache, a flicker of resolve. "You're right," she said finally, her voice steadying. "She's been stealing for years, and the only reason she hasn't been caught is because she's protected by people on the district board. They've been looking the other way because she's been funneling some of the stolen money back into their pockets." The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. It was bigger than they had imagined, bigger than a single lunchroom, bigger than a mean lunch lady. Kayla's mind raced as she tried to piece it all together. "So the inspection," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's fake, isn't it? They're not coming to catch her. They're coming to cover for her. Ms. Patel nodded grimly. That's why she's been on edge lately. She's nervous because she knows you're getting close if the board finds out you have evidence. She broke off, her eyes full of warning. But that's all the more reason to stop her, Kayla insisted. If we don't do something, she'll just keep getting away with it. Ms. Patel opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the sound of a door slamming made them all jump. Heavy footsteps echoed through the cafeteria, and this time they knew exactly who it was. Mrs. Wilkins' voice cut through the air like a blade. I knew you were up to something. The group barely had time to react before Mrs. Wilkins appeared in the doorway, her imposing figure framed by the fluorescent lights. Her expression was colder than they'd ever seen it, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer. What do you think you're doing? She demanded, her voice dripping with anger. Her gaze landed on the papers in Ms. Patel's hands, and her face twisted into a sneer. You shouldn't be here. Kayla stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest. We know what you've been doing, she said, her voice shaking but determined. We have proof. Mrs. Wilkins barked out a humorless laugh. Proof, she said mockingly. You think anyone's going to listen to a bunch of kids? Or to her? She jabbed a finger toward Ms. Patel, who flinched but didn't back down. You've been stealing from the school, Kayla continued, her voice growing steadier, and you've been bullying Amaya to hide it. Everyone's going to know the truth. For a moment, Mrs. Wilkins didn't respond. Then slowly, her expression shifted. The anger gave way to something darker, calculated, dangerous. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. You don't understand what you're dealing with, she said. If you try to take me down, I'll make sure every single one of you regrets it. The threat sent a chill through the group, but Kayla refused to back down. You can't scare us, she said, even as her hands shook. We're not going to stop. Mrs. Wilkins' eyes narrowed, a gaze locking onto Ms. Patel. And you, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. I should have known you'd turn on me, after everything I've done for you. Ms. Patel straightened, her fear replaced by quiet determination. What you've done is wrong, she said, her voice trembling but firm. And I won't stand by and watch you hurt these kids anymore. Mrs. Wilkins' expression twisted into a sneer. You'll regret this, she spat. All of you will. Without another word, she stormed out of the cafeteria, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The group stood frozen, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Kayla's heart was racing, but her mind was already spinning with questions. What would Mrs. Wilkins do next? And how could they stop her before it was too late?